Okay, so as I said, we are the Channel Islands chapter, and we're delighted this evening to have as our speaker Robert Fitch. I first heard Robert talk about his research in a Weeders meeting out of UC Davis, and I was really impressed with the work that he's doing. And I was really glad that he said that he would speak for us because I think that it's an important topic. He's a restoration ecologist. And are you still a PhD candidate or did you actually
Yes,
file?
have not filed yet.
Okay. At the University of California, Santa Barbara. His dissertation work encompasses ecological restoration, invasive species management, and plant flammability. And he's been doing ecological research in our area on fire resistant landscapes. And this talk will explain how to reduce the impacts of plant fuels modification in the wildland urban interface. Um, I'm going to hand it over to Robert. The title of his talk is Balancing Fuel Management Goals and the Ecological Impacts of Fuel Modification. So go for it,
All
Robert.
right, great. You can see my screen. Sound good?
Yeah, if you want to, yeah, I think it looks
Great,
perfect. Thank you.
great. You see the right, not all my notes, right?
Correct.
Great. Yeah, very happy to be here and excited to share with you all what I've been doing as my part of my dissertation work. So there we go. First, I want to thank my thesis committee because this is part of a very large project, part of my dissertation work. So many lab mates, collaborators, numerous undergraduate volunteers, our funding sources, and without all of this, this large project would not have been possible. And I would like to thank Ellen for inviting me to speak with you all today. So as we've seen in the headlines a lot recently in California, people are in conflict with wildfire. And we want to protect our homes and we want to mitigate wildfire risk. And this often leads to what we call fuel modification. And in Southern California, these areas are often created in chaparral. And so, for example, we can see here in the foreground of this photo, a wildfire is approaching and a line has been cut using a bulldozer down to the bare mineral soil. And what you could imagine is that these intense disturbances of fuel management can cause ecological impacts as well. These disturbed areas become rapidly invaded by non-native plant species, and we know this contributes to the type conversion of chaparral ecosystems to invasive grassland. These areas also serve as sites for further degradation, being used as illegal shooting ranges, off-highway vehicle use leading to soil erosion, and dumping and littering. This is an example shot from the Los Padres National Forest, nicknamed the Glass Factory because of the amount of glass that has been left over here from littering. But fuel defense zones can also be critical when used with firefighting operations. They can decrease the fire line intensity, making it less hot so firefighters can attack it. It increases the surface contact area for fire retardant. It allows firefighters to actually access often steep and difficult terrain, and they're critically used as anchor points to light backburns. However, ecologists now agree that we have to start thinking critically on how we balance the ecological impacts of fuels management and the stability of chaparral in California and potentially avoid treatments such as this. Now, my primary research focus is in disturbed areas that become rapidly invaded by these non-native annual grasses. For example, fuel breaks, roadsides, and areas in the wildland urban interface, the WUI. We are focused on grasses, these annual grasses, because these areas are often ignition hotspots. This data is provided by the U.S. Forest Service. These green polygons are the Angeles National Forest and the Los Padres, just north here of LA. Those are the green polygons, and all of these purple dots are a different ignition. And you can see there are numerous dots along roadways and trails. Major roads like the 5 and 138 have so many ignitions, they're practically a line feature. And many ignitions are butted up against the wildland areas in dense urban areas such as northern Los Angeles. And so this is definitely a really big issue that we hope we can address by improving the fire resiliency in these types of landscapes. So we focus on grasses because how they contribute to wildfires. Annual grasses do their phenology, they dry rapidly and they do not decompose. So what essentially is happening, they grow in winter and leave kindling in summer. Because grass fuels are so fine, they are easily ignitable, and this fuel then can carry fire from disturbed areas into wildlands. And we know this is responsible for creating larger and more frequent fires on the landscape. So firefighters do not want these types of areas to go back to chaparral. They want to be able to utilize them to protect communities. And what specifically am I talking about? I'm thinking about the WUI. So in defensible space, zones 1 or 2, etc., within 30 meters of actual structures we're going to protect, roadside ignition corridors, which could lead to disastrous fires, and potentially staging areas. This example from the Sierra National Forest, all those red circles show nice seeding and flowering yellow star thistle, a very invasive plant where these firefighting trucks and staging area are going to then go out and spread throughout the forest potentially. What if these areas were full of Stipa and Escolcia instead? And then fueled zones around communities and vital infrastructure zones like telecoms or electricity, right? I want to be clear that this work does not support massive landscape level fuels reduction treatments in shrubland ecosystems. But what I'm going to talk about is how can we go from something that's grass dominated and ignitable to something that uses native species to reduce wildfire risk, gain their ecological benefits, and still allow firefighting operations. Well, the next logical question would be then, well, what would we want? What kind of characters would we want out of plants that would reduce their ability to ignite and carry fire? Well, we know that having a smaller fuel load, so how much biomass per unit area, how much plant matter in an area, if you have a smaller amount, you have a less probability of starting a fire. You would want plants that produce less dead litter. Dead litter or dead biomass in general is much more easy to ignite than living tissue. And you would want your tissues to have a high live fuel moisture content. That means there's a lot of water in the leaves and in the stems. And then, of course, you can actually directly measure ignitability in the lab and in the field. So for my dissertation, my central question is, how do native and non-native plants actually differ in their fuel fire characteristics and their ecological benefits? So to answer this question, we did a restoration project in the Los Padres National Forest in Santa Barbara, California, just in that little red square. We established several plots within an actively utilized fuel break. This is the famous East Camino Cielo fuel break. Many of you may or may not be familiar with, but it's a major fuel break that divides the front country hills from the coastal cities of Carpinteria, Santa Barbara, Goleta, etc. And so what we did is we created a few different types of plant communities. We outplanted a native bunch grassland with perennial grasses and forbs. And then for our other native community, we seeded in annual wildflowers, right? Because we could imagine how these different types of plant communities might respond differently to fire and have different ecological benefits. And we did weed these plots free for several years. Just ask my undergraduates all about that. I'm sure they loved it. And then what we did is we compared these plots to the control, which was just the current vegetation. So numerous annual grasses such as avena and several bromuses, even fescue, some mustard, and also yellow star thistle. And then what we measured was fuel load. So how much biomass per unit area are these plots creating? We measured the percent litter cover and how thick that litter layer is of all dead material. Then we measured how much water content is in the live leaf component. And then we actually measured ignitability in the lab. For our ecological traits, we measured floral availability and floral diversity. And then we measured habitat use. Are they being used by animals that we would want? And these are just results for several years of our monitoring data. So to dive in to look at fuel load, all of my figures are going to have date on the x-axis with these same lines. With the black line is always going to be the non-native plants, the current fuel break disturbed vegetation. And these are all going to be means and standard errors for those of you who really like that part. And we can see at the beginning, our restored plant communities are pretty small. But as the years go on, plants grow, they get bigger. And by the end of 3 years, our restored native communities were equal in fuel load to the non-native plant communities that already exist there. So the same amount of biomass, but we didn't make things worse, and they were native plants. However, this is a very different story for litter. For all 3 years, non-native species had more dead litter biomass, and the cover of those plots, the percent cover of litter, was also greater and even trending upwards, meaning that non-native communities, these plots of grasses and etc., are accumulating dead biomass on the landscape, which is easily ignitable, which we would not want to see. And the litter, that depth of dead material on the cover didn't really change for native communities. They stayed really consistent over time, potentially meaning that their tissues are actually capable of rapidly decomposing and not accumulating in these plots, which is a good thing for native plants. So for this next figure, this is live fuel moisture content. So if you're very high on this scale, it means you have a lot of water per dry mass in your living tissue. We monitored this much more intensely every 3 to 4 weeks to try to see how things change over time. And so it's the same lines on this figure. And what you'll see is what we expect, that plants are wet during the winter and spring, dry down over summer, and this pattern repeats annually. Now you'll see that this red and green line at the bottom, the red line is the critical threshold for extreme fire behavior for chamise, or Adenosma fasciculatum, that the Forest Service uses. And during these pretty dry years that you can see, chamise tracks that green threshold pretty consistently, right? It's right at that critical threshold throughout these 3 years. But what I want to do is just focus on the dry summers, right, where fire danger would be the most important to think about. And you can see the black line, our annual grasses bottom out in summer, they become dry and dead. Whereas our native perennial plants retain live fuel moisture throughout the entire summer. And just note, I never watered these plants after I installed them the very first year. And so we do see that native annual plants tend to lose live fuel moisture as well, right? They're annual, they're going to die. But remember, they didn't accumulate dead biomass on the landscape, right? Their tissue's breaking down. So native plant communities, they retain live living water tissue in their leaves and stems longer over summer. And in some cases, we have over a 6-month advantage over if it was just all annual dead grasses. So what about testing ignitability? Well, we actually went out and harvested whole plants, because these are mainly forbs and other herbaceous species, bring them into the laboratory, and we throw flaming hot fragments on them, and we can actually measure their ignition risk. And so hopefully we have the video working. All right, so we take them in lab, we run these trials over time. And you can quantify fire behavior in a real way, at least as real as you can in a laboratory setting. We tested annual grasses, our native annuals, herbaceous species, and some subshrubs. So let's just look at one sampling date in August of last year when it was the most hot and dry. On this figure, ignition risk is on the y-axis. So the proportion of plants that actually burn. So if 100% chance means every time we tested a plant, it lit on fire. And what you can see is here in my red box, the non-native annual grasses have one of the highest ignition risks of all the plant species we tested. The plant species at the far end that have zeros never actually ignited. So what about our ecological benefits, right? We measured the number of flowers per square meter just to get an idea of how many flower resources would be available to different types of pollinators. So we just counted that over these couple years. And what we saw is that during the spring, so that's May and June in these months, our native community plants had more flowers available for pollinators. And this pattern is similar in floral diversity, just measured like as a Shannon's diversity index. How many different flowers are we going to see as well? We have much greater floral diversity in the plots we restored with native plants. And this makes sense. The non-native communities are pretty much going to be dominated by a single species, maybe a mustard plant, maybe a yellow star plant that offers less floral resources than our restored areas. Now, to measure animal use, also known as how animals murdered all of my plants in my pretty little project, we tracked as a kind of proxy for that, animal disturbance. So what we did is we took the difference between our cover surveys and of plant cover. So I added up all the actual percent cover of gopher holes, percent cover of deer tracks, of areas where other animals had unburrowed and ripped out plants. And I summed that all together so that if you're really high on this scale, animal disturbance, that means there's more of an animal presence in those plots. And these are just by spring and summer. So in the very first year, we see that there was a lot more animal use or disturbance in these native annual plots, and really not a lot in the native perennial plants at the bottom there in that blue color, which makes sense. When we installed these perennials, they're really small. And this pattern kind of changes over time, where in 2022, we see that there's more use of animals in the plots where we use native plants. And then entire switch in 2023 where much sorry a great reduction in the use in non-native plants and a really heavier use in ours, especially over summer. Why? Probably because our plants were still alive in the summer. So our native plant communities had more evidence of habitat use, especially during summer, which is a good thing. So, and most of this was probably deer and gophers. So to wrap up, how do native and non-native plants differ in their field characteristics and their ecological benefits? We would want something that has a smaller field load. Here we broke even. We would want something that produces less dead litter. That was a win for native plants. We want something with high live fuel moisture content. That was also better for native plants. And what about actually testing something that's less ignitable? Again, native plants. We would want more pollinator services. We saw that it was greater in animal use or habitat. We saw that was again greater for native plants. And as a very small teaser, we are now moving this work to the landscape scale using herbicide and a combination of drill seeding and hydro seeding to look at acre scale plots. We have pilot projects in the Los Padres and in the Cleveland National Forest, where we're trying to take these methods to a really big scale that would matter. And we do have some early promising results. This is just an aerial photo I took of one of our sites where you can, we did a good job of controlling annual grass. That line demarks where we did not spray glyphosate. You can see on the right-hand side, greatly reduced fuel continuity, reduced fuel load, and all of those shrubs there that are coming in. That is natural recruitment, native plant regrowth without us even having gone in and done restoration yet. And the last data graph I'll show you is that even after we've installed plants using hydro seeding and drill seeding, this fine fuel load that's so risky for ignition, we were able to reduce by 3.5 times less when we did this restoration project. So, did we achieve our goal? I would say yes. In conclusion, native herbaceous species can provide a less ignitable vegetation cover that allows for active wildfire suppression operations while boosting the ecological value of strategic areas within the WUI and along roadsides. And I think in hand, this shows that fire resiliency of the landscape is reduced by the invasion of non-native grasses. I really see this as a win-win scenario for managers and ecologists. And hopefully, if these areas are more aesthetically pleasing, right, full of poppies and lupins and not yellow star thistle and dead mustard, then hopefully agencies and communities will be more invested in them. And people will hopefully treat these landscapes with more respect, hopefully reducing their mistreatment and further degradation. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. That was great.
Thank you.
I was particularly interested in moving it to larger scale because, as somebody who does a lot of weeding, that's a big challenge.
Yes.
So, do you imagine that continued weeding will be necessary? Um,
Hmm. Yeah. Yes. So, right, it's very difficult, I think, to do that level of restoration and not have to go back. We've seen so these projects are only in their second year, and we've already seen reinvasion because they were very much pilot projects where we didn't come back with replicate treatment, but we did a very good job of getting them down. So reinvasion is a problem, and I think that kind of speaks to the two things I always say is one, if you're going to do it, you have to really prioritize an area, and two, commit to keeping it that way, right? And limiting re-disturbance, limiting reinvasion, which is, of course, super hard. And so we're now in those trials, we're trying to quantify, like on a dollar value, like where do you need to go um, to be successful that's not cost prohibitive. And we're trying different methodologies, but it is a commitment.
I was just going to encourage people to turn on their videos if they would like. And Robert, I think you have at least one question in the chat. What are your initial policy recommendations for land managers? That's the one I'm thinking of.
Hmm. Let's see.
If you want to read it.
Yeah. So my initial, policy recommendation, which is kind of a hard one, which would be to limit invasive grasses in your landscape, which can be extremely difficult, especially in places that are completely invaded. So what we suggest is doing a prioritization where looking at where ignitions have occurred or could occur in the future, where you think you would really want to keep fire out, and then try to reduce grasses or find fuels in those, really critical priority areas, and try to replace that with some more ignition resistant vegetation. That is part of future work we're doing too, is okay, what would that look like? But knowing um, your landscape and where ignitions would occur, right? There's those data sets now that exist would be um, something I would do that hopefully answers that.
So I'd encourage others to ask a question if you want. You can either just raise your hand in your Zoom square or you can put your question in the chat.
I have another question while we're waiting for other people to come up. Um, Maybe it's more of a comment, but it seems like, with the fire break concept, that seems to be an important concept to many people who work on the fire lines. Um, I Does this not lend itself to sort of enhancing those kinds of fire lines? Like if maybe you do have a scraped bare dirt, but then surrounding it, some, 50 yards on either side, the effort into restoring native plants into that area. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I think that we would like to see that in these areas, right? Instead of having them just turn into weed patches, have them be something that at least has more ecological value than bare ground or, I mean, of course, non-native species have ecological value, but promote that more in a native systems way that us ecologists really care about. Yeah, I would see that as being something that would be useful, and where we would do that, at least around infrastructure we really care about.
It looks like you have another question in the chat from Kaylee.
Yes. Which native perennials do you think would strike a balance between firefighter accessibility and ecological benefit? So that's something we always think about. Usually that precludes the use of anything woody, because again, our kind of goal is to keep it very herbaceous and short. That way, it can be utilized by firefighters. And the more tall, woody vegetation you have in there, the more likely they're just going to bulldoze it down, right? Because that's obviously the quickest method. Um, but so we try to think about it in height and then in woody, so nothing super tall. All the species, the woodiest species I used in this project was Diplacus arentitis, or sorry, and it can get kind of bushy, right? And I think that's kind of pushing it a little bit and being a little too much of a bush. But we're thinking a lot about native perennial bunch grasses, um, and things like pseudonaphalium, something like that. Um, Sometimes we want think about buckwheat, but that might be again might be a little too woody.
That you want
Um,
something that retains moisture in the summer, but is flexible and that they can gain access through.
yeah, and if they can walk on it and crush it by foot, it is probably the right thing for them. Yeah, exactly. Um, I see one asking about Caltrans. So yeah, I am a scientific advisor for the Southern California Ignitions Reduction Program. It is a multi-agency program led by the Forest Service looking at how do we stop ignitions in Southern California. And Caltrans as director is on that team, and they are extremely receptive to please tell us how to do this so we don't cause fire, which is great. And so they're on there. I've interacted them with a few times, and they're really pushing a lot of new research and management activities to try to tackle this issue. Um, and so, let me see the question. So, roadways are one of our primary targets. We have three separate, or I forget how many, several projects actually targeting how we would do this in roadways, and Caltrans is inside of all those conversations. So hopefully that will become really productive.
Looks like you have yet another one on, do you have a sense of how interested land managers are in committing resources, time and money to restore these treated areas?
Yeah, and so I think at least in where I work in with the SCRP, the Emissions Reduction Program, and others, they're very much willing to engage um, in this because there is a ton of money. Southern California was designated a priority landscape for fire danger, I think a couple of years ago by the governor's office. So there's a lot of money. Um, and they very much see themselves in a triage mode of wanting to get research done and do things differently and try stuff. And so um, I think in the circles I've been in, they're very receptive and willing to do things. It's been, I think it's a very good time for this kind of issue.
And you have
Um,
one that's asking you how they can continue to follow your research and support your ideas.
yeah, you can't, I have I'm on that. Oh, I can send the slides, but you can find me on the D'Antonio Lab website at UCSB in either EEMB department. I can maybe send that to you, Ellen or Terry, later if you want, to touch base about research. And as I move forward with things, um, that would be best. I'm pretty responsive by email and like connecting with people and thinking about fire and native plants.
We
I
could
see
put
another.
something in our next newsletter for you if people would like to get in touch. if that works for you.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I see one by Rachel. Wildland urban interface, encourage people to plant these perennials near their homes. Yeah, right. What to plant near your house is a huge topic. And right, I think this is part of the puzzle. If you look at the larger piece, defensible space, community planning, and home hardening are critical, and then vegetation is one of those components. And so, again, what we think would be a new way to view these areas that people typically don't really respect and become invaded, they could serve their same function in a native state and not in non-native dominated state. And I would hope that's what something we could get to. But landscaping, it, specifically in people's homes, might be a lofty goal. But I think around communities and things like that, this is definitely applicable.
Yeah, I was just looking at the City of Ventura fire, what do I call it? The fire department list of plants to not plant next to your home. And it's like every native that we have here.
Yeah. Yeah. The native lists are the UC A&R did a review study of 55 lists of fire-wise plantings for the state of California, and their conclusion was that they lack scientific evidence, make conflicting recommendations, and are often based on not the correct principles. So I would, yeah, definitely take those with a grain of salt. No one ever wants chamise on the landscape anywhere. It's so pretty.
Well, I think
Um,
the County of Ventura biologist is interested in reviewing those lists and she's asking us for help. So maybe we can make some.
That would be a good idea because I have heard directly from people who are trying to landscape in
Mhm.
a wise way, and you hit it on the nail on the head. Their conflicting lists tends to be very highly native plant focused, because we all know that native plants need fire. Well, that's
yeah.
not a very scientifically sound argument, and I think research like yours is really going to be needed to figure out which plants are the best for around people's homes. But I think your work is already beginning to show that in the areas away from the home directly, that there are definitely some good native plants that you can use, especially if you're replacing the horrible native or non-native grasses and mustard, which are so highly flammable.
Hmm.
Well, are there any other questions for Robert? We will put his information and information about his website and information about the D'Antonio website in our next newsletter so that you can contact him if you want to. Is there anybody else with a question?
Thanks, Robert.
Yeah, thank
Thank
you
you.
so much. We
Thank
really
you so much.
appreciate it.
It's great.
You're spending your time with us this evening.
Yeah, thank you. It's awesome.
So yeah, it always feels so lame clapping on Zoom. Anyhow.
That's okay. We've done it for years now. Um, yeah, we can have that information if anyone wants to keep chit-chatting. I'll put my email. I'm happy to discuss stuff.
Oh, did you want to put your email in the chat?
Oh, that's great. I'll just do that now. Absolutely.
Okay, great. There
There you
you
go.
go. You are now released to the masses. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, and big prize to everyone who is here and made it through our crazy passcode thing that happened at we've never needed that before. We don't know what's going on, but you guys all get the prize for making it into the meeting. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. And please, Scholarship Committee, you can just stay online. We'll continue our meeting.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Ellen,
Hey, Annie.
can you remove folks that are not in the scholarship committee?
Yeah, let's see if I can.
And perhaps stop the recording.
Oh, shoot.